All right, we're back. We have Brady Holmer and Sam's here as well. Brady, thanks for coming on. Could you give us a little intro on yourself and some background?
For sure. Chris, Sam, just wanted to say thanks for having me on. Excited to chat to you guys today about the topics we have planned. So, yeah, a little bit about myself. My name, as you mentioned, is Brady Holmer, and I have a bachelor's degree in exercise science, exercise physiology, kinesiology, kind of all the names are interchangeable depending on what school you went to. I received that at Northern Kentucky University in 2016. And then from there, I went to graduate school at the University of Florida. I'm still enrolled in grad school program at the University of Florida, pursuing my PhD in exercise physiology. Focus there has been on cardiovascular physiology. So topics ranging from, the effects of exercise on blood vessel function and blood vessel stiffness, cardiovascular health, and then also took a research interest in how sleep impacts cardiovascular health recently. And so that's kind of what my dissertation project has been on, and that's been a fun topic for me to explore. Aside from kind of the academic stuff, I've been a lifelong endurance athlete. So I competed in high school and college in cross country and track, and then continue today to do endurance athletics recreationally. Do road races every now and then. Engage in some cycling, so I'm still pretty active, and I still love competing when I can. I live in Austin, Texas, with my wife and our newborn son. So we have a 2 year old son now. So that's been quite the life change. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit of my background.
For some reason, I thought you were still in Florida. I was born and raised in Austin, just left. That's great.
Oh, is that right? Cool. I
Yeah.
had no idea. Yeah, we left Florida last year. We've been in Austin for about a year. So my wife actually had a job in Austin. It was remote, and we had to move here because they were returning to the office. So we moved to Texas as I continued to kind of like finish up my degree remotely. So it's a weird situation, but yeah, we were in Gainesville, and now we're in Texas.
And do you want to chat about any of the things you're doing outside of your research? I know you have your own podcast, you have a Substack. Maybe briefly chat on those.
Yeah, Yeah, for sure. I guess I should have mentioned a few of those. So I do. I've been really even since starting graduate school, I was really interested in like science communication and writing about science in addition to doing the research. Sometimes even a little bit more than that. I found myself like getting really interested in writing versus doing the research in the lab. So, but I kind of found this passion for it, and so I do write weekly on a Substack about topics like exercise, health, nutrition, sleep, kind of whatever, suits my fancy that week. And I'm also, I guess I should mention, I am employed by examine.com. So there I write about supplements, nutrition, diets, things like that. And so for the listener, examine.com we're basically a company dedicated to just talking about science to help you be healthier. So we tell you what supplements work, what doesn't, what diets are out there. And then recently we've kind of forayed into looking at other interventions like exercise and sauna and how those can help improve health. So my main role there is as a researcher. I just kind of like read research all day and update people on the best things out there for your health. So that's really been fun. I've been there for about a year. Great company, and we're really trying to make big moves in the nutrition and kind of health space and give people good information.
So that won't be the topic for today, but I think that would be a great topic to have you back on for. But for today, we're going to chat about VO2 Max. So you've done a lot of research in this area. You're very knowledgeable. Can you initially start just by explaining what VO2 Max is and maybe a brief history on the study of it?
Yeah, certainly. So VO2 Max is interesting because it's for some reason become very like popular in like the media lately. I think Peter Attia, I think he's had something to do with that because he has this new book Outlive, and he's all real rah about VO2 Max and like how important it is, which is great. I think it's fun to see topics like this come into the mainstream. So, but yeah, so VO2 Max, I think it would be good to start with just kind of a brief explanation of like how our body produces energy using oxygen, and then that will lead into kind of what VO2 max is. So when we're like resting, when we're sitting here, or when we're exercising, so our body needs to produce energy. So when we're exercising, obviously we need to produce more energy than when we're sitting. But in general, we use oxygen to create energy in the form of ATP. So we breathe in, that oxygen gets transported throughout our cardiovascular system, blood vessels, to our muscles. Our muscles then sort of extract that oxygen and use it to turn substrates from the food that we've eaten and our stored glycogen fat into ATP as energy. And so when we start exercising, our demand for ATP increases and our demand for oxygen then increases. We need more oxygen to produce energy at a faster rate because the demand for energy production is higher. And so what VO2 max is our body's maximal rate of oxygen consumption. So it's the fastest rate at which we can produce ATP using oxygen. And it's most often kind of used as an indicator of your cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular, or your aerobic fitness. So people with a high VO2 max are said to be, very aerobically fit. You'll typically see high VO2 max levels in elite endurance athletes like cyclists, marathoners, cross-country skiers have historically kind of been shown to have some of like the highest VO2 max values. But yeah, so it's your body's maximal rate of oxygen consumption, and that can be expressed in liters per minute. So it's like an absolute value. How many liters per minute of oxygen are you utilizing? Or as a relative value, so expressed relative to like your body weight. So milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. That's typically, if you do a VO2 max test, what your results are going to come back as a relative value, because it needs to be expressed via your body weight, just because larger people will have a higher absolute VO2 max just because you're bigger. If you're bigger, you have more overall body mass, more muscle probably, and so your body's just going to be using more oxygen. And so using it indexed to body mass, your body mass is going to kind of equal it out among people. So you can compare a large person to a smaller person to see who's fit because you're normalizing it to their body mass.
And can you give some standards for those top end elite endurance athlete? What is considered a very high VO2 max? And then for maybe the general population who doesn't train and that middle ground of recreational endurance athletes, three different
Yeah.
kind of
So
ranges.
Yeah, so as a general rule of thumb, so I'll list the numbers for just kind of off the top of my head because they're more readily available for like males. As a general rule of thumb for females, it's just going to be about maybe like 3 to 5 mLs per kg per minute lower. And we don't have to maybe go into detail on why females have absolute lower VO2 maxes, but generally it just has to do with like the size of the heart. So males will have larger hearts on average than females, and so that is going to allow for like greater cardiac output and stroke volume. So for males, an elite value is going to be somewhere above like 60 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and that would be elite. So elite athletes, above 60. Just for reference, like there have been in there's like a debate as to whether these values are legit, but like some cross country skiers, they've been shown to have like, I think the highest ever was like a 92 or a 95 or something like that, which is just like bonkers crazy. So, typically if you measure something like an elite real marathon runner, they're going to have like a low to mid 80s, something like that. But typically anything above 60 is considered to be quote unquote elite. Um, Great would be anywhere from like 50 to 60-ish, maybe even 40, or I would say 50 to 60-ish would be considered like the great. If you're between 40 and 50, I would say that that's good. And then 40s or below, you're kind of getting into that. Unfortunately, you want to say below probably 35 to 40 is average, but average is not necessarily going to be what we would call good. You don't want to be average in terms of your VO2 max. So within the 30 to 40 range would be like average. Anything below 30 would definitely be considered like substandard, and in need of improvement there. And again, those are kind of values for males. So add or subtract like 3 to 5 mLs per kg per minute for female values.
Do you have a reason why you think that the sports like cross country skiing tend to end up resulting in possibly some of the higher potential VO2 maxes versus running?
Yeah, so that definitely has to just do with the fact that cross country skiing is a whole body exercise as compared to running. So if you think about the cross country skiers, they're using their legs because, that's obviously the main kind of muscle group that's going to be used during cross-country skiing, but they're also using those poles when they're working out. So they're really engaging their arms, as opposed to, sure, when you're running, you're, moving your arms, but you're not really engaging your arms. Runners are going to have real thin, like tiny arms. Use me as a perfect example, but cross-country skiers might have like larger arms in general because they're actually using them to kind of propel. So it's whole body training. You're using your whole body during that sport versus, say, cycling and running, which are just going to be predominantly lower body sports.
So why should we care about VO2 max, and what is the value of it from a performance perspective and then from a general health and longevity perspective?
Yeah, so for performance, obviously, kind of the implication there, again, as I mentioned, elite endurance sports typically require a high VO2 max. If you go to a road race or cycling road race or something like that and look at the elites, they're always going to have a high VO2 max. It's sort of a prerequisite to kind of like get into the club. You're not going to have an elite marathon runner with a VO2 max of like 50. So it's clearly important because there are you need to be able to extract a certain amount of oxygen to have this high VO2 max in order to actually kind of reach those levels of performance. Because if you just think about it, so most obviously endurance exercises are going to be, even though they're completed at a sub-maximal intensity, we're not running a marathon at our VO2 max. So we're exercising at a certain percent of our VO2 max. But essentially, even if you're exercising at 75% of your VO2 max, if you have a higher VO2 max than somebody, if you're both exercising at 75%, but your VO2 max is higher, well, you're going to be able to run faster than they are at a lower kind of perceived exertion. So having that higher ceiling is definitely beneficial for just being, better and having better performance. But it's definitely not kind of the be all end all in terms of performance that I think some people might think it is. So the person with the highest VO2 max isn't necessarily always going to win the race. And I think sometimes people might misconstrue, this guy has a VO2 max of 80, this guy has a VO2 max of 70. Well, of course the 80 is going to win because he has a higher VO2 max. That's not always the case because other things definitely are important for performance, like your ability to exercise at lactate threshold, your exercise economy. So how efficient are you when you're running or cycling or doing whatever, for example. So I like to say it's like necessary to be an elite performer, but not sufficient. You need to have all these other kind of performance metrics in order to be successful at endurance performance. And multiple studies have shown that you can improve performance without improving your VO2 max, and people should know that as well, because it's like, oh, well, I've been training for 8 weeks, and I've even had people like just reach out to me on Twitter and things like, well, I trained for 8 weeks, but my VO2 max didn't improve. Well, yeah, but other things definitely improved. Maybe you got, more economical in your running form, or, your lactate threshold improved. So your performance can improve without increasing your VO2 max. And that's especially going to be true for people with a very high VO2 max already who don't really have that much room for improvement. So it's certainly necessary for performance. And, if you're looking to improve your fitness through training, VO2 max is, definitely a good metric to look at. But it definitely shouldn't kind of be the sole focus of, this is the only outcome we're like interested in for like a training, from a training perspective.
And then switching to health and longevity, what
Yeah.
is its value there?
Yeah, so there's been like a lot of interesting data lately, kind of linking VO2 max with health outcomes and longevity. So just come from like a broad perspective, just from all of like the recent kind of studies that have come out, it does tend to seem that up to a certain point, the higher the VO2 max, like the longer you'll live. So people with a higher VO2 max have better reduced risk of all-cause mortality, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, reduced risk of disease compared to people with a lower VO2 max. Some studies have definitely shown that there's kind of a threshold. So, it's not a linear relationship where if you just keep increasing your VO2 max, you reduce your risk up to an indefinite point. There seems to be a level where it kind of plateaus. But there definitely have been some studies, and there's one in particular that was, I think, in like the Journal of the American Medical Association that showed even up to like the elite level VO2 max, they even had reduced levels of all-cause mortality compared to people within the lowest. So literally it was a linear from lowest VO2 max and like the sub-average up all the way up to elite. Your risk was reduced as the fitter you got. So pretty interesting data there. And so another study kind of showed, for example, they did like a dose response and showed, if you just increase your VO2 max by what would be known as one metabolic equivalent. So that's 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. You can reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by around 10 to 11%. So pretty significant. 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. You could reasonably. That's something that most people could reasonably improve with an exercise, routine, just doing like 6 to 8 weeks of high intensity or even like moderate intensity interval training. So a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality is, pretty substantial. And then there have been other studies kind of showing that if you just compare the highest versus the lowest in terms of VO2 max, that could be associated with almost like a 45% reduction in all-cause mortality. So again, like the numbers are pretty substantial in terms of people with a higher level of fitness fare better than those with a lower level of fitness. And so, yeah, it's definitely, some pretty compelling data there. And a lot of the, another interesting thing is that the reduction with, say, improvements in fitness or the risk reduction with VO2 max, it tends to be even stronger than that for like traditional risk factors. So if you lower your blood pressure or you lower your blood glucose or improve your blood lipids, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, or even like people who quit smoking, the risk reduction with VO2 max is better than all of those. So it seems like it's more important than like the traditional risk factors that we consider. So that's kind of interesting because like VO2 max isn't something you typically assess when you go to the doctor. It's just get your blood panel and measure all these things, but that definitely tends to seem to associate better with outcomes compared to like some results of a blood test, for example.
Can you discuss the gold standard of measuring VO2 max in a laboratory setting, and then other options if there are for general population that doesn't have easy access to a laboratory setting?
Yeah. So the gold standard would be to, if you wanted to get your VO2 max measured, is definitely to visit like a lab. A lot of that's becoming more available to just like the general consumer, which I think is good. I mean, if you live in an area where there's like a major or even like a minor university or a sports medicine clinic or something like that, a lot of those places will offer a VO2 max test or a metabolic test. A lot of the universities will actually do them for very cheap because it's training for the people who are like in the lab. So I know I just did one last year at the University of Texas. I think it was like $70 for do a VO2 max test, which is for the wealth of information you get from that. It's, not a lot of money. Some of the other sports medicine clinics might be a little bit more, but they also might give you a little more information than if you went to university or something like that. So yeah, so the gold standard would be to go to a lab, and what happens during that test is essentially, you're gonna, if you've ever seen the commercial where like Lance Armstrong is, strapped up to the mask and all the tubes and things like that, you're gonna be doing that. You might do it on a treadmill, you might do it on a cycle ergometer, but during that test, it's known as a graded test to exhaustion. So you're gonna start off at, maybe walking flat on the treadmill at a, reasonable speed. And then that test just progressively gets harder and harder. So the treadmill grade probably increases. The speed probably also increases a little bit until you reach a point of volitional exhaustion. Basically, you say, I can't go anymore. And during that test, you'll be wearing a mask and your oxygen consumption and your carbon dioxide production are continuously being measured. And so once you reach that point of exhaustion, you'll have some readings of what's your oxygen consumption at that point, and then that will determine what your VO2 max is. And that's the gold standard. So metabolic cart measurement of oxygen consumption, that would be the gold standard. That's going to give you the most accurate, information on what your VO2 max test is. I would say below that, there are field tests that you can do. And so these are pretty simple. They're not easy because they require you to run, pretty hard. I mean, if you want to determine your VO2 max, you're going to have to give a maximal effort, during whatever test you're doing. But There have been some running tests, mostly running, that have been validated kind of in a lot of populations of people, and those can be used to predict your VO2 max. So the most popular one of those is known as the Cooper 12-minute test. And basically what that just involves is you go to a track or just go outside, I guess, and you run as far as you can in 12 minutes. So again, it's pretty easy, but it sucks to do because you just have to run as hard as you can for 12 minutes. And so what you do then is, you calculate how far you run in 12 minutes, and then whether you use like an online calculator or you can just like look up the formula somewhere online for that, you can plug in your distance that you ran for that test, and it'll spit out your VO2 max. So that can be a pretty good way to estimate it. As I mentioned before, that test has been around for a long time. It's one of the more popular ones, and it's been validated in, males and females and different participant demographics. And so it can give you a reasonable idea of what your VO2 max is based on, how far you ran in that amount of time. So the Cooper test, again, is the name of that one. And that's an easy kind of field test that most anybody can do. And it's, it's free. You can just get your watch and go outside and do it. There are a few other tests. You can go out and run a mile, do a 1.5 mile run. And again, there are sort of prediction equations online where you can just put in your time. How long did it take you to run a mile? How long did it take you to run 1.5 miles? And then you can put it in that equation and it will give you kind of what your VO2 max is. So I would recommend those for somebody who's not, willing or unable to maybe make it into a lab to get that gold standard test. And then finally, lately, and maybe you both even have one of these on your wrist or on your watch, but the fitness trackers that most people have now, a Garmin or I don't think Oura Ring does it, but like a Whoop strap or something like that. All of these things typically will give you an estimated VO2 max now. So the accuracy of those is somewhat questionable. They're not perfect, obviously, and there's a lot of factors to consider. Is your body weight entered into your app correctly? It bases those measurements and those predictions on, your latest kind of performance or your latest run or your latest ride. So there can be a lot of error in those estimations. I think what those could be useful for is looking at trends. So even if it's inaccurate, if your VO2 max is 60 and it says your VO2 max is 40, okay, well, that's not accurate. But if your VO2 max goes from 40 to 48, you can be assured that your VO2 max probably increased, even if that number might not be perfectly accurate.
Going to that change in VO2 max, let's say someone's tested and they have a number. How much can someone actually train and improve their VO2 max over time?
Yeah, so it's kind of like an interesting topic of VO2 max and this idea of what people will call like trainability. And so there have been exercise studies like in the past, kind of when this concept came to be, of, there were exercise quote unquote non-responders. So people, they enrolled in this exercise study and they did this exercise test, but for some reason they didn't respond. So their VO2 max like didn't increase. And so these people were labeled as like exercise non-responders. And so this kind of initiated this whole, I'll kind of call it a debate, because among exercise physiologists, it's sort of a debate. But can one even increase their VO2 max, or is it like genetically set? Are we genetically predisposed to have a high or a low VO2 max, or are some people do some people have a more trainability? So are they able to increase their VO2 max while some people might not be able to increase their VO2 max? I think in general, the consensus now is that most people can increase their VO2 max up to around like 25 to 30%. Again, the type of training, though, I think that will get one to that improvement will be different. So I think that everyone has the ability to increase their VO2 max, but I do think that trainability among individuals varies. And so what that can involve is some people might need more of a stimulus to increase their VO2 max compared to others. And there are, a bunch of factors that can go into that, different genetic factors, different, factors related to just kind of your own physiology. And so, that's probably like beyond the scope of talking about here. But the trainability aspect, I guess, there's definitely no doubt that everybody can increase their VO2 max with some type of training. I think that's been pretty like well fleshed out. And so they've done some interesting studies where they've, kind of shown that. And so essentially it seems that if somebody doesn't respond to a certain training intervention, so somebody would be considered a non-responder, basically you're just not providing them with enough training. So if somebody their trainability seems to be low, or they don't increase their VO2 max much on 3 days per week of training, well, when you provide that person with 2 additional training sessions per week, then they're able to increase their VO2 max. Or if you're doing 4 sessions per week and increase it to 6 sessions, then that person can increase their VO2 max. So it's definitely trainable, and everyone seems to be able to increase it to the same extent. Again, maybe besides the people at the, way far end of the elite category who have less room to improve. That improvement capacity is there for everybody, but the degree of training to get there is definitely different. So that also might include or might necessitate higher intensity training for somebody. So there are some people who may respond off of, some moderate intensity training and 1 HIIT session per week, whereas other people might need 4 or 5 high intensity training sessions per week. So it just seems overall, it just seems like the dose and the intensity are the variables that matter in terms of determining somebody's trainability. So exercise prescriptions should certainly be like individualized to fit those people's needs. The general guidelines, or which are just 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity training, or 75 minutes of high intensity training, those definitely aren't going to allow everyone to improve their VO2 max. And honestly, if you ask me or maybe even other people, I'd say those kind of exercise prescription guidelines are way too low. I know most people don't even achieve them, even given how low they are, which is kind of disappointing. But I think that, if you just look at how many people respond to the guidelines-based exercise prescriptions, that's a fairly low amount. And that's just likely due to the fact that they are like too low. So I think that if the reason that we see this maybe lack of trainability, or this, people saying that, oh, VO2 max isn't that trainable, well, that's because most exercise training studies just use the guidelines and put people in that training program and say, oh, how many people responded, how many people didn't respond. But more kind of rigorous studies, upping the dose, upping the intensity of exercise, definitely show that people respond when you provide them with more exercise, which seems obvious, in hindsight. But
you had mentioned this earlier, these other factors and metrics that you can track, whether it's lactate threshold or running economy, when you're looking at the big picture of improving either running performance or any endurance-based event, what are the bigger priorities, and where does VO2 max improvement fit within that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would honestly say that for most people, I think your starting point definitely matters. For most people, if you're kind of starting from a like lower baseline, any type of training that you do is probably going to improve most of like those metrics. And so it may not even be necessary to focus on, say, a VO2 max session, or a lactate threshold session, or an economy, session. So all types of training are kind of going to work. So if you do some high intensity training, it's going to, improve all those kind of aspects. But I think, in terms of what to focus on, it's kind of hard to maybe prioritize, but I just think that definitely in terms of the hierarchy of performance, I think that things like economy, there's this new concept out there called like critical power, which is essentially like the speed or the power that you can, the max speed or power that you can hold. Kind of that would be like your race almost intensity. And then lactate threshold, I think working on the lactate threshold and economy type stuff is going to yield more bang for your buck, I might say. So working on, because again, as we mentioned before, if you're competing, most of what you're competing at is going to be occurring at these lower intensities. So you just want to improve your running economy, your efficiency, and that's, I think, going to yield more improvements for performance versus, say, targeting improving like your VO2 max. I think so. I guess that would be my my suggestion, if somebody were to just kind of like focus their training sessions, kind of focus on the running economy type of stuff versus maybe just VO2 max, even though it is important, obviously, VO2 max, as we've been talking about this entire time.
So now if someone were to try to focus on that, how do they actually implement that? What kind of changes do they do to their training to prioritize improving running economy?
Yeah, for sure. So for running economy, the best thing to kind of do for that is going to be, I mean, I guess it's important to note before is like all types of training are going to be important. So you want to do very, very high intensity training sessions, although less frequently because those are definitely stressful. And your low intensity training sessions that don't necessarily target running economy, your zone two training as it's kind of popular now. You want to do all of those because it's integrative into your training program. You want to improve your aerobic base. You want to improve your power and your anaerobic power through those training sessions. But I think if you were going to target, say, exercise economy or lactate threshold, longer, kind of moderate to high intensity intervals seem to be the best for doing that. And so something like a 4-minute interval around like maybe 85% of somebody's VO2 max or training near your lactate threshold. Those are going to be the types of training, the longer interval type stuff for improving. And 4 minutes is just kind of used as an example, but it could definitely be longer. A runner, one session I like is something like mile repeats. Those are something, or like a tempo run. So something you could maintain for a while. You're not thrashed at the end of it. Those types of things are going to help you improve your running economy and your running threshold because you're not maxing out, but you're also not kind of going too slow. So things where you're able to focus on form, things where you're able to focus on breathing as well. Those are all definitely going to be kind of good types of training sessions. Obviously, there's lots of nuances, and we could talk all day about just like the different interval structures and different intervals intensities or whatnot. So I'm kind of being very vague here just in terms of like the length and stuff. But I would say like, yeah, longer interval sessions seem to be the best for improving economy and lactate threshold.
How much of VO2 max is based off of just genetic predisposition to having a higher or lower VO2 max?
Yeah, there's definitely a big genetic component, and this was interesting. There a few years ago, I went to like a American College of Sports Medicine conference, and there was actually like a debate where they debated like, oh, is VO2 max genetic, or how much can it be improved through training? And so you had one guy arguing that VO2 max was almost all genetic. So people were you were predisposed to have a high VO2 max, or you were predisposed to have a low VO2 max. I think the consensus, or what seems to be available from the data, is that yes. Sorry, my dog's found his way in here somehow. VO2 max, there's definitely a genetic component to it, and so somebody. I think that most elite athletes who are born with an incredibly high VO2 max, that was obviously kind of genetic, but I don't think that genes equal destiny from that perspective in terms of like, oh, if you don't have an elite VO2 max, that doesn't mean to say that you can't necessarily improve it substantially. You may never get to that elite VO2 max. I think genetic wise, there does seem to be kind of a predisposition, or like maybe a limit to everyone's VO2 max that you can get to. But I think everybody has the potential to get to that limit. As far as like the percent of contribution to VO2 max, I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily been completely fleshed out in terms of like, oh, it's this percent nature and this percent nurture. There are some studies that will provide like maybe some numbers, but I don't think there's kind of a consensus on whether there's a certain percent of it that's determined by genes versus determined by nature. So yeah, so again, I do think that they've done some studies on like twins, for VO2 max and things like that, and shown that those do show that there's a significant genetic component to VO2 max as well.
Have you seen anything discussed about early training during childhood and how that impacts the long-term potential for VO2 max?
I can't say I have like seen anything on how like early childhood training does, but it's an interesting idea because I feel like you do see, I think that kids maybe have a predisposition towards, say, doing like endurance athletics when they're young. So it's interesting because I think there's somewhat of like a selection bias there going on. Because, if you just use maybe myself as an example, like we had like the mile run in gym class or whatever. And so I wasn't like training for running at that point, but I tended to be good at that. And so you kind of like get self-selected into then maybe engaging in larger amounts of endurance training at a younger age. I definitely think that beginning to engage in that type of endurance training at a younger age can put you on kind of a trajectory towards having like a higher aerobic fitness. But I think that in terms of like the kids who tend to do more training at a younger age are probably just being self-selected in there because, again, back to the earlier question that Chris had, like they have kind of a genetically predisposed like higher VO2 max, and so they're going to excel in endurance sports at a younger age. They're going to get into endurance sports. So whether it was getting into endurance sports at a younger age that then caused their high VO2 max, or whether they're self-selected into there and then their VO2 max was going to be high regardless. I think both of those could probably be true. But yeah, it's a
Yeah,
good
so
question. I'm not sure. I haven't seen like any kind of studies on that or whatnot. Just because when you get into like the idea of like studies on like children and whatnot, you kind of get into like murky waters, and it's like you're not gonna start these 3-year-olds off on a training program and see where they end up. There's a lot of ethical issues kind of are surrounding that.
no, absolutely. On the opposite end of the spectrum, like the strength and power world, that is one of the discussions that has been brought up numerous times, where at a young age, children possibly have like a um, trainability aspect of, will their motor neurons be transitioning more towards like a type 2X versus type 2A, because those might have more differentiation ability early on versus like the type 1 versus type 2 category. And so then does like a specific type of training stimulus encourage that transition, and then therefore encourage athletes to have a higher rate of muscle contraction? And I've seen that discussed a fair bit, but I've never seen it really discussed on the endurance side of things.
Yeah, it would kind of make sense though, because at that age you're definitely undergoing like a lot of different developments, and so that's kind of an interesting aspect. Is like, oh, if you're going to start them off engaging in more endurance training, are their muscle fibers going to then, their composition more shift more towards like that type 1 or whatever? Because we definitely know that muscle fibers are able to be, their type can shift and whatnot, or at least they can shift, maybe not from maybe slow twitch or type 1 to type 2, but like they can go from more oxidative to more glycolytic. So I definitely think that like doing more, I mean, and that's even in adults. So children, you would imagine, are even more plastic when it comes to kind of like how their muscle fiber types can respond. So yeah, that's definitely a different, interesting discussion for sure.
Yeah, there seems to be, typically most high level endurance athletes come from, doing some sort of endurance background like yourself at a young
Mhm.
age. But you do see the opposite. Like, I don't know if you're aware of like Lionel Sanders, who is like the high level ultra or Ironman competitor, and
Mhm.
he states that he has done no endurance training until he was, I think, like 25, and
Huh.
then he became, I think he's been on the podium at the Ironman World Championships 3 or 4 times now. So
Yeah.
pretty unique there.
Yeah. I mean, and you sometimes do see that where people will get into endurance sport like later in life, or I guess any sport for that matter, but just because we're kind of talking about endurance. And yeah, they'll like excel at it. So it's like, were they that? I feel like, again, this kind of goes back to like the people who are excelling at endurance sports, they have some genetic kind of predisposition, and maybe they failed to get into it at a younger age just because they weren't exposed to it, or they didn't have parents who got into it or whatever. But for some reason then they found it in later in life, and then they were able to kind of reach their potential. So yeah, it's very interesting. But and sometimes you even see, people who get into it later in life are doing way better than the people who get into it early, because they don't like burn out or maybe like exhaust their potential at an early age. I think there's something to that as well.
Do you mentioned Peter Attia, and I think he's largely spoken on VO2 max from a like health and longevity perspective, but either from that end of the spectrum or from the performance end, are there any common misconceptions or things that you feel like should be addressed in regards to these are popular opinions or thoughts, but largely they're just not true, or there's not enough research to support the statements?
Yeah, I think kind of one of them, I don't even know if this is like a misconception or as much as just I think I guess one of the biggest misconceptions, and I've even had conversations with people about this on Twitter and elsewhere, but I think people sometimes tend to think that, oh, VO2 max is kind of just, it's just like, it has to do with like your lungs or how strong are your lungs, or I guess that you can improve your VO2 max by improving the capacity of your lungs. And so you'll often see this in marketing as, those respiratory trainers, those kind of Bane from Batman like looking masks that people will wear, or just respiratory muscle training devices that are kind of available. Those will often claim to, be a way to increase your VO2 max. They're kind of called like altitude trainers, which is definitely a misnomer because they're certainly not like mimicking altitude in any way. They're just making it harder to breathe. But I think the misconception there is that, oh, if I can strengthen my lungs or if I can increase my lung capacity, then I can improve my VO2 max. That typically doesn't seem to be the case because the lungs don't necessarily seem to be like the limiting factor for VO2 max. And in fact, there's a really interesting, I think he's retired now. His name's Jerome Dempsey, but he's like a world famous like pulmonologist. And when I was at the University of Florida, he came and gave like a couple talks just on the physiology of the lungs. And he basically just talks all about how the lungs are kind of overbuilt for exercise in humans. In other words, like we have way more lung capacity than what we need when we're exercising. So they don't seem to be, when you reach your maximal exercise capacity, it doesn't seem to be that the limiter there is your lungs. In other words, you have enough lung capacity. So we're getting in enough oxygen. So improving that lung capacity, unless you have, say, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma or something like bronchitis, the lungs really aren't the thing that's limiting your VO2 max. So improving the strength of your lungs or whatever, using those devices or doing whatever isn't necessarily going to help increase your VO2 max. It definitely seems that other factors related to kind of your oxygen delivery, your mitochondrial function and capacity, and your oxygen extraction capacity are kind of more influential there. So that might be one of the biggest misconceptions is like, oh, the VO2 max is it's just like the lungs. And obviously the heart is involved, but typically people associate it with the lungs, and it just seems that that's kind of causing, those products and things like that to emerge, which don't really necessarily have any like scientific basis behind them. So that would definitely be one of the most common ones that I see around it. Kind of a Again, like I said, maybe it's not as much as a misconception as it is like a misunderstanding maybe about VO2 max.
If the lungs aren't the limiter, what is typically the limiter?
Yeah, so the limiter, it seems to be, and they've done some like, there's been some really interesting research here to kind of determine what limits it. So the lungs they can be, a limiter in some instances, as I mentioned, if people have like a lung disease affecting their, ability to actually get oxygen in and diffuse oxygen to the blood, that can certainly be a limiter. The cardiac output and, the ability of our heart to deliver blood is definitely a limiter. So one of the main things contributing to VO2 max, and one of the main reasons why we increase our VO2 max in response to training is something called stroke volume. And that's essentially when our heart beats and injects blood, it's how much blood is ejected per beat. So our stroke volume. And if you multiply that by heart rate in beats per minute, you get something called cardiac output. And cardiac output is one of the main things that will help determine or increase your VO2 max. So when you train, your heart gets stronger, it can increase how much blood is ejected, it can increase your stroke volume, and then that will help increase your cardiac output and your VO2 max. So that definitely seems to be, I wouldn't maybe say the limiter, but it's definitely one of the things that responds most to training. And so it's one of the variables that are kind of the most influential on what your VO2 max is. And, stroke volume, having a big stroke volume is one of the reasons why also elite athletes tend to have very low heart rate. So, just at rest at least. So for a given, say, cardiac output, which is heart rate times stroke volume. So if stroke volume goes up, resting heart rate will go down, so cardiac output can stay the same. So you just have these hearts with huge, like strong left ventricles, and so your heart doesn't need to beat as many times per minute if you're able to eject so much blood per beat. So just kind of one of the reasons, why you say, oh, you see athletes posting like resting heart rates in the 40s. That's one of the reasons why. So cardiac output, also one of the limiters, and then the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, how much oxygen the blood can carry, that's also another limiting factor. Again, in some kind of circumstances, so people if they have anemia, your hemoglobin goes down. So your hemoglobin content of your blood is going to determine, your oxygen carrying capacity. So people with anemia have lower hemoglobin. They're going to have limited exercise capacity and lower VO2 max, which has been shown. Things like altitude will reduce the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood because there's a lower pressure of oxygen at altitude. So that will, if you go to altitude from sea level, that will reduce like your VO2 max artificially. You're not getting less fit. It's just definitely going to be harder to deliver that blood. So those two things can be limiting factors. Again, if you have something like anemia or you travel to altitude, those are going to be kind of the limiting factor. And so all of those things that I talked about are sort of known as like the central factors that could be limiting VO2 max. And then we have peripheral factors, which are more related to like the skeletal muscle and the mitochondria. And that's kind of where some of the main limitations seem to be. In other words, why do we hit like a VO2 max? It seems to be that once we're at our maximal oxygen capacity or our maximal exercise capacity, our muscles, our mitochondria simply have this limiting rate that they can take up oxygen from the blood and use that to produce ATP. That seems to be kind of the limiting factor, quote unquote, for VO2 max is our ability to diffuse oxygen from the blood into the mitochondria to produce ATP. So it seems to be more of like a peripheral limitation kind of than a central limitation there. And even then, like our mitochondria, we seem to have sufficient capacity. So the main kind of limitation seems to be honestly just our ability to get oxygen to where it needs to be and to take up that oxygen. Because especially in elite athletes, if you kind of just think about it from this perspective, when blood is rushing through the capillaries, there's only so much time that it's in contact with the cells and the muscle cells and whatnot. So the diffusion time is very limited at a high exercise capacity. And so you're just simply not able to kind of get enough oxygen out of the blood when you're exercising at a really high rate. So that seems to kind of be the limiting factor there. But there's obviously a lot of them can kind of be involved, and there have been some very elegant experiments to try to determine like where the limitation is, which have been kind of interesting. So
as we age, what do we know about VO2 max changes the older we get?
Yeah, so with age, this is a very kind of interesting area. So with age, across the board, there seems to be a almost like linear, I would say, decline in VO2 max. So up to about like age 30, VO2 max seems to increase, and maybe like mid 30s or whatnot, VO2 max seems to increase. And then between age 30 and 40, multiple studies have kind of shown that there's a linear decline in VO2 max, about 5 to 10%, I think, per decade. And this is in males, this occurs in females. And I think what's more interesting is that this even seems to happen in people who continue to exercise and people who continue to maintain high levels of physical activity. And the rate almost even seems to be the same, which I always found to just be weird. I'm like, man, like how is the rate the same? The rate of decline the same in people who don't exercise or those who do exercise. But regardless, kind of what the data show, there's like a 5 to 10% decrease per decade in VO2 max. What's I think important to note though is that if you take physically active people and physically inactive people, even though they have the same rate of decline, once it starts to decline, the active people have way higher baseline of VO2 max. So they might be starting at say take somebody who starts at 65 mLs per kg per minute at age 30 and somebody who starts at 40 ml per kg per minute at age 40. Okay, well, at age 70, that person who started out with 65, now they might be at 40 or 45 mLs per kg per minute. That person who started off at a 40 is now at like a 20 to 25 mLs per kg per minute or something like that, just to use an example. So the active people, they start off with a higher baseline, and even though their rate of decline is similar, I'd argue it's probably a little less. These are just from a few studies, and so it's not, depending on the population we look at, it could be different. But starting at that higher baseline will definitely serve those people better in the long run, because there has been shown to be like a certain threshold below which you can't really function and do activities of daily living. It seems to be between like 15 and 20 mLs per kg per minute. And that's like below that, you're considered to kind of be frail or have like a frailty phenotype. So you're going to have trouble getting out of a chair. You're going to have trouble walking across the room at that VO2 max. So that just goes to show that, before this decline even starts, you want to kind of elevate your baseline as much as you can. Similar to, Sam, you mentioned like muscle mass and power earlier. I think the same goes to show that we can't indefinitely increase our muscle mass as we age. There's a point at which it's going to start to decline. So building up your reserve before it starts to decline is definitely crucially important for health and longevity, because the decline does happen regardless of what we do about it. There are certainly things that we might be able to do to slow it, but that decline is going to happen. And just to mention again, Peter Attia, but he often talks about, what do you want to be able to do at age 70 or 80? So let's just use myself for an example. If at age 70, I want to be able to run, a 5K in, I don't know, it's hard to say, but maybe like 21 minutes or something like that. Well, what VO2 do I need? What does my VO2 max need to be to do that? So if my VO2 max needs to be 55 mLs per kg per minute at age 60 to do that, well, this, back cast, what does it need to be now? Well, maybe it needs to be 75 or 80 now if I want it to be 50 at age 70. So you can kind of use that to say, oh, here's what I need to do to kind of offset that decline or start at a higher baseline and look at what your goals are at that age. Because, yeah, 15 to 20 is that threshold of frailty, but we want to be well above that. You don't want to just be like scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of, oh, well, I'm at 28 mLs per kg per minute. I can have a functional VO2 max. We want to be able to do things and whatnot. So, and again, I think, I'm citing a lot of data here, but I tend to take an opinion of like, I think a lot of, those come from, again, just very specific cohorts and one or two research studies. I tend to have the opinion that, if you are able to stay healthy and maintain a decent level of physical activity as you age, I think we can slow that decline in VO2 max a lot more than kind of has been shown. I think a 5 to 10% decrease per decade may not be inevitable. So I would like to see kind of more rigorous studies on that. But, the main thing that's going to cause that decline is people just are less active with aging. It's what happens if you like maintain activity with age? I mean, theoretically, it's kind of like an interesting thought experiment, but if you're able to maintain the same volume and intensity from age 30 to age 60, does your VO2 max actually decrease? Like, who knows? I definitely think there are some structural changes that occur, like to the heart, autonomic nervous system, and whatnot, that will decrease your VO2 max. Things happen as we age, and it's not, you can't literally just stay young forever. But I'd be curious to actually see, and unlikely these studies will ever be done, but if people maintain intensity and volume with age, can you keep up that aerobic capacity? Similar with like muscle mass and things like that. If you keep up your protein intake and continue to strength train, like, can you keep on some of that muscle that we see is tend to be lost with age?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 points there. Number one, hit me where it hurts. Hit me where it hurts, man. Your goal 5K when you're 70 is my current 5K. So, but yeah, I think that's really interesting. I live in a really popular community for individuals to retire, and I see a very high number of people. I own a gym, and we get tons of people that come here who are retirees who previously were, moderately active at best, and then they retire, and now they want to get fit. They're just after it because now they have lots of time, and so they actually increase their overall activity level. which is interesting. Like we don't do VO2 max testing, but we definitely run some Cooper's tests and see. But I'd be intrigued to see, like, if we had a way of knowing what they were at when they were 30, what are they possibly able to get back to now, like 30 years later, after not maintaining it? Like, how much can they improve and regain? Like you said, there's obviously the structural changes, but some of that is reversible.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think it is reversible, and there's kind of this idea of like the muscle memory too, that I think like if you were once active, like yeah, you were really fit and active in your 30s, you took like a 10 to 20 years off, but then you try to take up training again in your 40s or 50s. I think those people definitely can have some like increased responsiveness to training. But it also like I think you hear a lot about like, oh, you can't increase your VO2 max with age, or you can't increase your muscle mass with age. Well, you can if you're starting off. If you've never trained before, you're certainly going to increase your muscle mass and VO2 max with age. Like, I mean, yeah, if you have a VO2 max of 70 when you're 30, it might not increase with your as you age. But if it's 40 and you've never trained in your life, then people can definitely increase it. I mean, there's no doubt about that, I think. And same with muscle mass. It's like there have been plenty of studies now recently showing 50, 60-year-olds increasing their strength and their muscle mass. So our ideas about like exercise physiology and training are definitely changing, I think, as we learn more and are just like, well, the I don't know, our concepts of aging are changing as well. It's like people can be way more active and fit as they age than we once thought. It's not like you hit 60 and everything just goes to hell.
Yeah, one of my favorite research studies probably ever is actually on an elderly population where they implemented drop sets, and they just basically smashed these people that were like 65 to 80, and then they monitored them for like 12 weeks. I think it was like 3 days a week of just full body drop sets, and they all gained like 2 to 5 kilos of muscle mass
Huh.
in a matter of 12 weeks, which is just like an absurd amount of muscle to gain. And there was two groups, like one that took creatine and one didn't. Like that was the intervention, and creatine did
Mm-hmm.
basically double the gains, but still, like these are, in some, I think the oldest participant was like 82, and they still gained 2 or 3 kilos
Wow.
of muscle mass, which is just ginormous. But they came from no training.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the nutrition thing is interesting because I also think that yeah, we think about exercise, but like you also have to definitely prioritize like protein, and I think creatine too for like older people is probably an indispensable like supplement as you age. That's something I've been thinking about supplementing with recently. The data on creatine now is just like seems like everybody should be taking it. Like there's not a reason not to, right?
Brady, before we wrap up, is there anything else about VO2 Max that you feel like you want to chat about or we didn't directly address?
Yeah, let's see. I think we kind of covered, I just wanted to reiterate the point that it wasn't like VO2 max is obviously a super important thing for performance, very important thing for health and longevity. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not like the be all end all for performance. So I think that just to not be singly focused, like if people are listening and they're going to be interested in their VO2 max or looking at their VO2 max on their smartwatch or whatnot, to not be solely focused on that number, because you can increase your fitness in multiple ways and your VO2 max might not even budge. And so again, I mentioned earlier that like people will sometimes reach out and say, oh, like why didn't my VO2 max increase? I've been training consistently. It's if that doesn't increase, that doesn't mean you didn't get fitter. It just means that maybe your VO2 max is the same, but you're able to exercise a higher percent of it. So you became more efficient in your running or your cycling or whatever. So you can improve your performance without increasing VO2 max. That's kind of just one thing that I wanted to make sure. Then the other, I think there was like one more thing, kind of going back to the genetics thing. It's like, oh well, there was this argument. I think I posted a paper on like the VO2 max and longevity thing a while ago, and somebody was just like, well, because we know lifespan just in general has like this genetic component to it. It just seems like if you live to be 90 to 100, it's probably because you got good genes. Like maybe we can extend our lifespans a little bit by using lifestyle, but I feel like if you're going to be living to 100, it seems to be like encoded in your genes or something like that, just because the centenarians often don't have like very good lifestyle habits at all. They're usually like not doing much. So I posted it, and somebody there was like the VO2 max and longevity, and somebody posted, oh well, is it just that like people with a high VO2 max do they live longer because they're just like genetically predisposed to have a high VO2 max and live longer? Or is there actually an effect of physical activity on helping them live longer? So, in other words, does somebody with a high VO2 max live longer even if they didn't exercise to get that VO2 max? Or is there like a role of physical activity? And that's kind of an interesting question, but I think the argument against kind of that point would be that we have all this data showing that physical activity, even in the absence of, even independent, I guess, of VO2 max, is important for improving or reducing risk and improving all cause mortality, for instance. So I just think that, sure, maybe just genes or, yeah, they'll bless you with a high VO2 max and they'll bless you with like living longer. But I definitely think there's a causal relationship there, not rather than just like this mere correlation between it. So if you exercise more, that will lead to an increased VO2 max. And I do think that VO2 max increase is causal in promoting longevity versus just correlated with it. Because when you improve your VO2 max, like all of these aspects of health are contributing to it. Your mitochondria improve, your heart health is going to improve, things like that. Even like your brain health is going to improve. So I think we know that those things are going to cause you to be healthier and live longer. So there's not there's this debate like, oh, is it just an association? Well, yeah, it is, but I definitely think there's like this causal effect there too, that if you increase your VO2 max, that's going to cause you to live longer. So that's kind of something that was on my mind as well. But it's always a very interesting discussion when you get the epidemiology studies. Do people with a higher VO2 max, are they just do they have better socioeconomic status? And that so things like with physical activity as well. It's, do people who exercise more, are they just do they have more access to physical activity gyms and whatnot? So, but I think we have enough data now to say that exercising more causes you to be healthier. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Some might disagree, but
Sam, any other final thoughts or questions before we wrap it up?
No, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Brady. This was awesome.
No, of course, this was a great discussion, and it's a topic that's near and dear. I think it's very interesting to talk about just VO2 max, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm glad it's becoming popular. And I'd even decided to kind of like write this series around it, and that even helped me learn more about it myself. Obviously, and just kind of all the things that go into determining VO2 max. But I'm glad that it's getting attention and that people are interested in it, and it seems to be like even gaining in the popular press. You'll see like articles on why VO2 max is important. So I think it's good. It's good to see that people are taking an interest in this type of stuff. But I appreciate you guys having me on to chat about it. It was a lot of fun.
For people who want to reach out and talk and ask more questions directly, or just learn more from you, where can they go?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter. So if people want to follow me there, it's at B_Holmer, HOLMER. Most active on there. I have an Instagram and stuff, but I rarely post on those, so I probably won't even mention it. And then earlier I mentioned that I write a weekly Substack. I'll post on there a few times per week. Typically a long form article, like a deep dive into a topic, and then also just like a Friday newsletter where I break down a study that I found interesting. So the name of that is Physiologically Speaking, and people want to find that, they can go to, I believe it's bradyholmer.substack.com. There you can find it and subscribe if you like, and then you'll just get kind of emails whenever I post stuff. But those platforms are really what I'm putting most of my energy into, so you can find kind of about what I'm doing if you follow me on either of those.
Great. Thanks again, Brady.
Yeah, of course, Chris, Sam, thanks a lot.